Okay, so in the last video, we learned how to create functional components, and those are simple enough, but now we're going to look at the other side of the coin and learn about class-based components. Class-based components are practically the same as functional components in terms of how you use them, but the syntax is actually radically different, and so we're going to explore what differences they have and how to create class-based components as opposed to functional components. So the main difference between a class-based component and a functional component is that a class-based component utilizes ES6 classes and the React.component superclass. And this is a good time to bring up a small point about React and about the React 17 update, because you'll notice in our functional component from the last video, all we are doing is defining a function and then exporting it. But before React 17, what you actually had to do was at the top of your file, you had to import React from the React library. And the reason for that is that Babel, the JSX transpiler, needed the React library to render any JSX, because every JSX expression would be turned into not just HTML-like syntax, but it would be turned into a call to a React function called createElement, as you can see right here. And so for that reason, you always had to import React from the React library when you're making a component. But that's not true these days, but only for functional components. Because with the React 17 update, instead of importing the React library, Babel now imports a JSX transpiler, so it does not need access to React.createElement. So that was just a small digression I thought was necessary. And the reason I bring this up is because when you're making a class-based component, you still need to import the React library. And we are going to see why in just a second as we learn how to make a class-based component. So first step, just like a functional component, is to create a JS or JSX file with the name of the component. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to delete this products file that we created in the last video. So we're just going to actually delete this as well as the directory that was in. The only reason I'm doing this is to just be explicit about what I'm doing in every video. So now we're going to recreate the products directory, and then inside of it we're going to create, no, not a folder, we're going to create a new file called products.jsx. And the next step is to define a class. But first things first, like I said, we need to import React because we're going to be using it directly. And then next we are going to define a class that is the same name as the component. So you can see right here, it says class products extends React.component. And if you're not familiar with ES6 classes and inheritance and that kind of thing, I highly recommend you look into it. I will leave some links down in the description to some reference material in case you're behind on that. So we're basically just making a subclass of the React.component class. And that is why I said we need to import React in every class-based component file, because we are using the React library directly for the component class. So let's go ahead and do this. I'm just going to create a class called products, which is the name of the component, and it's going to extend React.component. So React.component. And that is the first step done with. So the next step is to add a render method to that class. And basically the render method tells the class what to do when it is rendered. In the majority of cases, this is very simple, usually just returning some JSX markup. In other cases, it can be a little more complicated. And for those of you who already have a bit of familiarity with class-based components, you'll notice that I'm not adding a constructor right here. The reason for that is because we have not gone into state and props yet, so I'm going to hold off on the constructor method for a little bit. So let's go back to VS Code and open up this class and just add a render method, just like that. And that is all we need to do right now. But I did misspell that, not rudder, I meant render. The second to last step to making a class-based component is to return JSX markup. Just like with functional components, there is no difference here. We just return it. We just use the return keyword and then add in some markup. So we're going to do the same markup as in the previous video. So let's return and add some parentheses. And then inside of here, we're going to return a div with an ID of products. And inside of that, we're going to add an h1. And inside of there, we're going to write products page. Now the final step is to export the component. There are several ways to do this, just like with functional components. The first one is to just add in the export keyword before the class declaration. The second way is to do it on a separate line, which for some reason I prefer, maybe because it's just more explicit. And in order to do this, we have to write at the bottom export class products. And you'll notice that in the slide, I forgot to add this. I repurposed the slides from the functional components video, so that's why that is not shown here. I just made a little mistake. And then the final way is to use a default export. So to do this, we're going to write export default products. and that will create a default export. So now in order to use this component, I'm going to go to the app.js video, just like in the functional components video. And I actually don't need to change this, but I'm going to rewrite it just again to be explicit about it in case you missed the last video or something like that. So we're going to import products, and you'll notice that VS Code is already providing the path, but we're going to do this manually. We're going to import it from /views/products/products. And again, we do not need to add the JSX extension. You can if you want to, but it's not required. And then down here inside of the app component, I'm just going to render the products component just like that. And now if I go to the terminal, I'm going to make this, let's see if I can make this bigger. Yep, there we go. I'm going to run the development server with npm start, and that will run the app in the browser. And now that it's rendered, you can see that just like in the previous video, there are no differences. It just says products page, which is the H1 we rendered in the products component. So in the end, there really isn't a difference between how a functional component and a class-based component work or how they look on the page. It's actually mostly a matter of personal preference. I much prefer functional components. I find them easier to understand, and they're just way easier to create, especially when we get into things like state and props and hooks and all that. So we are going to be using functional components throughout this course, but I am going to be covering class-based components as well as functional components because they are still used by many people. And if you get a job as a React developer, they may require you to use class-based components. So they are still important to understand, and it's important for you to be able to use them, but we are definitely going to prioritize functional components. So that concludes this video. In the next video, we are going to go into the structure of a React app. So we're going to learn what to name our directories. For example, when I use the views directory in here, I'll go back here, you could see under source, I created a directory called views. So I will explain why I did that in the next video. We are going to create other directories such as components, assets, all those things we're going to cover in the next video. It's quite important, so I recommend you do not skip it, even though it is not the most interesting subject. So stay tuned for the structure of a React app, and I'll see you in the next one.